It's my pleasure again to introduce another of the distinguished members of the Boundary 2 Collective. My voice is fading as if I were talking all day. I want to introduce to you Christian Thorne, who is here today from Williams College. And I discovered today, and if it's been there before today, I apologize for not seeing it before, but if you look at Christian's Williams webpage, you'll find extremely witty, clever, and elegant description of Christian by himself. I can steal from it, I could read it to you, but that seems unnecessary. Instead, if I'm allowed, what I think I would prefer to do is simply point you in two other directions. One is to Christian's quite wonderful book, The Dialectic of Counter-Enlightenment, which I strongly recommend you spend a good deal of time with, because it catches not only a considerable amount of study of the intersections of German and other Western lines of thought around questions that we've been concerned with today, but also because, and now I speak purely personally, it was to me an enormous pleasure to read and to learn from. So I recommend it as strongly as I can. And then the other thing I want to refer you to, in case you don't already know this, and you should, is you should know Christian's Commonplace book, where you can find some of the very best unpublished, as yet unpublished, reflections on criticism, literature, culture, film, chopping wood. I think to be found among literary writings on the web. Christian Thorne, Commonplace book, subtitled Politics, Philosophy, Horror Movies, Rock and Roll. And it has an absolutely wonderful picture of what I think is a cricket bat.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah, it's a cricket bat, absolutely, swinging a cricket bat.
Yeah.
And that is Jacques Derrida swinging the cricket bat. So that's the flavor of the site, and I strongly recommend it to you. So, but that's all I'm going to say about Christian now, because he will say more than enough to make you understand how he thinks. His paper today is called very simply, and this resonates with all of us here, What We Once Hoped of Critique. So welcome, Christian.
Friends, hello, how you doing? So I have my own way of wanting to mark B2's anniversary. B2 and I share a birth year, so I suppose I take this especially personally. I've launched on my first big piece of work that comes directly out of conversations with bounders. So it's what I want to describe today in some very preliminary way. It's very new work. We're all bringing works in progress. This is work that is barely begun. But it does come out of reflecting alongside people in this room and other bounders who aren't with us today. So what I'd like to do is lay out in some detail the occasion for the new book, for the project. The B2 fingerprints will be on that. And then try to give you a reckless sense of the book's major claims and objectives in something like a thesis form. That said, given the origins of this work, I am even more than usually eager for you to tell me afterwards which questions you think I'm going to need to answer in the course of carrying this project through, on the understanding that I probably won't be able to answer them today. But I will note and reflect on your every misgiving, I promise. So an opening question. Is Marxism a form of critical theory? Or rather, do Marxists practice that something we call critique? Now that question is likely to strike people in this room as a little silly. If we know anything about Marxism, after all, we know that it is critical. that it's the very model, in fact, it's the epitome of oppositional knowledge or of thinking that pledges itself to the emancipation of people and maybe animals and maybe objects, and not to their exploitation. In some contexts, the words Marxist and critical function, in fact, as plain synonyms. So for a longish stretch, critical geography simply was Marxist geography. Or the anthropologists, they turned critical on their own usage once they started reading Immanuel Wallerstein and Andre Gunder Frank. And the Association for Critical Sociology still greets visitors to its website with a quotation from Marx and a definition of capitalism. So do we really need to ask whether Marxists practice critique? The Marxists themselves plainly think they do. One might as well ask whether Freudians practice analysis. So here's one way of grasping why that question is nonetheless worth posing. In 2015, Rita Felsky published The Limits of Critique, a 240-page drubbing of the left-wing humanities in the half-century since Adorno and Derrida were first translated into English. The tendency among the book's many reviewers has been to treat it as the final word on its subject, as Critique's obituary and autopsy, as an invitation to move beyond critique or to dispense with it. The Los Angeles Review of Books says that Felsky frees her readers from critique, frees us, that is, from the thought that thought it could free us. One reason to ask again, then, whether Marxism is quote-unquote critical is that a lot of people have decided that they are done with critique. Looking again at Felsky will help us take the measure of their impatience. Whatever her protestations to the contrary, Felsky's arguments often have the character of imminent critique. Judged by its own standards, critique stands accused of being uncritical. It offers to challenge the status quo, but when it gets assigned to every graduate student, it quickly becomes the status quo, a kind of syllabus thought, an obligation that misapprehends itself as an insurgency. Sometimes hostile to narrative on the theory that all stories are manipulative myths, it nonetheless boils down to a single story form, a melodrama obsessively staged, in which capitalism or discipline or white supremacy or heteronormativity or patriarchy hijacks our culture or our discourse or our minds. Officially anti-authoritarian, it asks us to read like cops, convinced in advance of every novel's guilt, scanning all literature for evidence of historical crime, every argument an indictment, every poet a perp, every naive reader an accomplice. Above all, critique sees itself as a kind of dissent, a bane to common sense, free thinking amidst late capitalist platitude. And yet critique is itself taught as a method, an iterable, predictable set of argumentative techniques, a bow to your partner square dance of intellectual moves, a called tune. So a liberationist and experimental philosophy morphs into a set of pat intellectual routines and inquisitorial mythemes. A different kind of writer would have named her book The Dialectics of Critique. And yet, you will recognize that The Limits of Critique was written by an English professor when you notice that its preferred criteria of judgment tend to be aesthetic ones. The problem with critique isn't so much that it is wrong, that it begins from mistaken premises and so tends to generate false claims, but rather that it fails to surprise, that it is a tool not for baiting the bourgeoisie, but for boring them. In this sense, the book that Felsky has written is less an argumentative refutation of critique than a literary analysis of same, a catalog of critique's language, of its conventions, tone, guiding metaphors, and narrative templates. It's a rhetorical handbook wearily compiled, an anti-manual whose listing of writerly techniques is supposed to make these harder to adopt. The effect of all this is to classify critique as just another genre among many other such, though Felsky, of course, is writing in a genre of her own, which is the anti-theory polemic, itself a staple of the theoretical age. One might wonder, after all, what sets Felsky's account apart from Terry Eagleson's After Theory from 2004, or Walter Ben Michaels and Stephen Knapp's Against Theory from 1982, or E.P. Thompson's Poverty of Theory from 1978. These have been around for a long time. But then no sooner are these titles listed than one is reminded that Felsky has renamed the object of her animus, and our question thereby shifts. What we now ask is the difference between rejecting theory and rejecting critique. The commonplaces of the old anti-theory scripts are easy enough to retrieve, that theory settles disagreements by invoking the authority of its gurus, that it claims the magical ability learned from the philosophers to stand outside of practices and presuppositions, that it is abstract and homogenizing, reductively indifferent to particulars, that it refuses to read. In this light, what stands out about Felsky is that she's very much going after a way of reading, about which she levels two persistent allegations. First, that critique reads all literature in a mood of suspicion, convinced in advance that every novel, poem, and play is guilty of some historic injustice, and that the reader's most pressing task is to ferret that injustice out. Second, that critique claims to know better than the text what the text is communicating. To hear critique tell it, the one thing that an utterance cannot mean is what it initially seems to mean. The real meanings of all writing are hidden and counterintuitive and achieved only via exegetical labor. But then when Felsky asks the literature professors to reject exegesis, to relinquish the claim to know what a document is really saying, she's not just attacking theory. She is attacking the fundamental protocols of literary analysis. All it takes to spot the radicalism of Felsky's position is to read her introduction, where she confesses that the book's working title, does anybody remember this, was The Demon of Interpretation. In other words, that she had been tempted to demonize interpretation as such, and not just the Marxo-Lacanian kind. So English, it's worth recalling, the English language is the only language taught in our universities that distinguishes between critique and criticism. Right? The title of Kant's great book could just as well be translated as The Criticism of Pure Reason. Right? A German literary critic practices Literaturkritik. So in languages other than English, to denounce critique is automatically to denounce criticism as well. And I would say that's the difference between denouncing theory and denouncing critique. Felsky is attacking in one, both theory and the criticism that many used to advocate as their preferred alternative to theory. And with that, I want to see if I can put across what has been puzzling and not just antagonizing me about Felsky's position. So I'll say first that it has to do with the status of Marxism in her thinking. So it can't come as any surprise that Marxist literary theory is one of her main targets in the limits of critique. In fact, she wastes no time naming Marx as one of her antagonists. There he is in the introduction, on the first page, in the first paragraph, a mere 4 sentences into the book. Or in a work that mostly describes a diffuse intellectual mood and that catalogs a set of argumentative conventions so widely shared as to be anonymous, she nonetheless singles out Frederick Jameson as bearing special responsibility for our plight as teacher of this mood and stoker of suspicion. Or again, she's fed up with the way in which that whole battery of Freudo-Marxist reading techniques informs the arguments even of scholars who don't take themselves to be Freudians or Marxists. In Felsky, you don't have to be even remotely socialist to be guilty of a certain Marxism. What's puzzling about this is that Felsky was or is, and I think that's an interesting question, was or is at least half a Marxist, and that she is or was at least half a Marxist in some considerably plainer sense of the term than the one I just outlined. So she concluded the introduction to her first book, published all the way back in 1989, it's called Beyond Feminist Aesthetics, by pleading with feminist literary scholars to spend more time reading Marxists. At that point, she was still wondering, I just want you to hear her idiom, what we might learn about women's writing if we agreed to proceed more dialectically, her term. To pay attention to the forms of contradiction, she said, that overtake literary production in the age of late capitalism. Our feminism, she wrote, would be modified if we paused first to consider the function of literature in late capitalist society. She remarked in the opening pages to her third book, meanwhile, that her intellectual life got into gear, I'm quoting, only when she stumbled across the work of the Frankfurt School. So what gives? What gives? Of course, there's an easy answer, right? Felsky might simply have outgrown her Marxism. She would hardly be the first one. The limits of critique might, to that extent, be the document of a certain minor apostasy to be kept on the shelf alongside Ignazio Silone and the post-war volumes of the Partisan Review. Maybe critique is Felsky's failed god. And yet the matter, I think, can't be quite that simple, since it isn't entirely clear that she has changed her mind. So in Beyond Feminist Aesthetics, that was the first book, Felsky came out against post-structuralist accounts of feminist writing, rejecting the claim that an experimental and anti-realist writing, that 70s formation of écriture, that was the only authentically feminist literature, and promoting in its place the basically middlebrow and readerly genres that were central to the really existing women's movement in the 1970s and 1980s. She wanted at least to account for the appeal of that unfancy writing and specify its political accomplishments. And lurking behind that project was a second, more general argument that she made fairly clearly, that we can't let the theorists trick us into deriving from philosophical premises our criteria for what counts as good feminist writing, that there exists no authoritative philosophical model for feminist writing, that no mode of women's writing can be considered outside of history and situation and circumstance, that what we needed instead was a sociologically based model, her phrase, that didn't pretend to settle the matter of women's writing once and for all. Hence, too, Felsky's argument in The Limits of Critique, where we find her arguing still or again that scholars schooled in European theory are too prone to pull rank on the literature to which lay readers are sincerely attached. Rather than examine these attachments, she says, rather than consider how they are made and what they enable, Kritiker are determined to expose these attachments as naive and thereby sever them. The alternative, then, would be to flush out and indeed salute the sociality of literature. That's the idiom she shifted to or is revising. To strengthen attachment rather than attenuate it, to seek bonds and alliances and relationship in the domain of literature, to league and consociate, to socialize the poetic. In both volumes, therefore, a philosophical avant-gardism is made to yield to the affirmatively social. It's just that in the later volume, the social enters under the name of Latour, and not of Marx or Habermas, Latour, who thereby occupies something like the Marx slot. So, the scholar who rejects Marxist critique is herself manifestly indebted to Marxism. More puzzling still is the simple fact that Marx himself often writes against critique. So we might think of the matter like this. Anyone still bothering to use the word ideology is hearkening automatically back to Marx and Engels' German ideology as the founding text of ideology critique. But let's pause to wonder whether or not it really deserves that title, the founding text of ideology critique. We don't need to worry for today's purposes about whether it can really be called a text, though there are serious questions on that front. So let's say you've been wondering of late about ideology. It won't be this room. You guys don't need to wonder. And you go back and you read the German ideology to see how this critique thing is done. Right? You turn to Marx for a lesson in Ideologiekritik. Well, what do you learn? Well, the first thing you notice is that the word ideology for Marx doesn't yet mean ideology in any of our senses. False consciousness, or the ability of the ruling class to get its beliefs accepted as true, or the secretly political dimensions of seemingly non-political things, or whatever your preferred definition of ideology is. It basically just means idealism. The title of the book, in other words, is actually just German idealism, although you can, if you like, hear intimations, even here, of ideology in that other sense, since Marx's argument is very much that idealism is a politically obfuscating doctrine. It is the hallmark of the German left. This is the nub of his argument. It is the hallmark of the German intellectual left that they overestimate ideas in politically disabling fashion. Right? I want to restate something in that lesson because I think it's especially important. Marx's book, The German Ideology, was wholly, page after page after page, an attack on the German left, an attack on his allies and his buddies and fellow radicals. Right? Marx, in other words, was not rejecting mainstream German political thought or Christian orthodoxy or bourgeois philosophy or whatever you might have expected to find him pouncing upon, at least not in the first instance. He was attacking radical philosophy for still being philosophy. In fact, the thinkers that Marx was going after were themselves all practicing a kind of ideology critique. Those philosophers held that people had to find freedom by liberating themselves from systems of false representation, intellectual idols, and fixed ideas. And this means that the book that we typically think of as pioneering the critique of ideology in the Marxist tradition is in fact an attack on ideology critique for giving too much weight to ideas. I think this should be reasonably clear to anyone reading it, and yet it seems to go almost totally unremarked in the scholarship. There is no such thing as ideology critique, at least not in a Marx-guided version of Marxism, because critique is in fact Marx's chief example of ideology. It is the last refuge of a thought insulated from practice and political organization, dissent that thinks that it can make do with attitudes and principles and clever argument. If you follow Marx, then ideology and its critique simply aren't antitheses, and the one great task for ideology critique to undertake in the present, which I'd say is our present, is to work out the ways in which critique is bound to be mystified just by virtue of being critique, and equally to work out how the administered world thrives on reflection and self-interrogation without being any less administered for that. A political formation approached at the level of discourse and of discourse alone will obligingly negate itself should negation turn out to be your preference. The capitalist will agree with you about the priority of uncommercializable goods. The imperialists will echo back to you the doctrines of national self-determination. There is no ideological constellation that does not contain at least the outlines of its own negation, nor is there a reliable technique for radicalizing intellectual negation to the point of absolute rupture such that it can outrun this snare. You get better at ideology critique mostly by giving up on the ideology of critique. A little biography will sharpen the point. Philosophically trained readers have always wondered how Marx became Marx. How did he wrest himself free from Hegel and the left Hegelians, and what exactly did he change in their methods and their positions? How much of Hegel's philosophy did Marx adopt? How much of it did he chuck? The answer to these questions isn't the least bit clear. People fight about this a lot. So multiple accounts have been given. I think they all possess a certain plausibility, even when they're not compatible. What we should be able to say to a certainty, what a simple course of reading should be enough to make plain, is that when Marx set out to declare his intellectual independence in his late 20s, his primary enemy was neither Hegelianism in general, nor Hegel's theory of the state, nor the support of the establishment Hegelians for the still monarchist Prussian government and its officially Protestant church. His primary enemy, the main target of his polemical fury, it was critique. So here's Felsky. In looking closely at the gambits of critique, its all too familiar rhetoric, I question the picture of critique as outside codification. And Marx nods in agreement. Some people write, this is Marx in 1845, and their entire contribution is the profusion of critical stock phrases. All they do is echo the stock phrases of critique. The subtitle of Marx's very first book, published 3 years before the Communist Manifesto, was The Critique of Critical Critique. Marxism is not the paradigm of critique. It is and always has been what comes after critique. Or is it? I mean, the phrase critique of critique obviously lets a person play it both ways, affirming negation even as it negates it. So all we can do is look closer. What was Marx doing when he wrote critique? And of course, the Marx readers in the room will know it's not a word he actually gives up on. Why did he and his fellows think that critique would emancipate us? What then are we giving up when we agree to stop doing it? And can we scan his attacks on critique in order to discern what Marx would have us do instead? We open a book of Marx's and expect to find critique. But what do we find in its place? All right, so that's the occasion for the book. At this point, I'd like very briefly to put to you 11 theses without explanation. This is just my best guess as to the shape of the book. They're not even proper theses. They're not elegant little kind of pseudo-Nietzschean provocations. They're really just, I'm going to read you my outline. All right, so number one, critical theory is not a synonym for Marxist philosophy. Marxism is what comes after critical theory. That's just summing up what I just said. Number two, we know who first devised the idiom of quote-unquote critical theory, and it wasn't Horkheimer. We know who, in other words, first used critique to mean the open-ended philosophy of emancipation, and who first linked it to the word theory, and it turns out it was Marx's mentor and first collaborator. Three, critique in its original formulation, this formulation, combined four different projects: Hegelianism, Jacobinism, radical Protestantism, and the historical and philological study of the Bible, i.e. what was referred to in the period as the higher criticism, or the higher critique, if you followed the German. Number four, this last, the higher criticism, is critique's proximate in the model and, in fact, the bestower of its name. So these philosophers were not, in the main, going back to Kant. They were borrowing the name from Bible scholars. Emancipatory critique came into the world as the politicization and universalization of Bible scholarship. The higher criticism applied to everything. Five, from radical Protestantism, critique inherits two distinct programs: antinomianism, that is the radical rejection of the law, which is the distinctive feature of German Republican politics. That's that determination to set up societies that don't cohere around the rule of law. And then second, it inherits from radical Protestantism a full-bore universalism, ergo the insistence that the critical theorist be no one in particular. 6, Marx opposed critique, and he did so on two grounds. He opposed it first because it remained a Protestantism in all but name, and so defaulted on its promised universalism. Marx's On the Jewish Question, often read as a testament to its author's internalized anti-Semitism, is in fact an oblique defense of Judaism against critique's Protestant premises. Marx opposed critique second because it continues to produce clerices, or even something like a critical elect, because it is a disguised Protestantism. It produces an aristocracy of critique. Number 7, there are many different paths past critique. I'm just going to list them. I'm sure this list is extendable. These are the ones I'm finding interesting. There's an institutional path, as laid out by Hegel. There's a path that is itself critical, as laid out by Bauer. There's an esoteric path, as laid out by Spinoza. This will be my chance to argue that Spinoza is not, in fact, a left Enlightenment philosopher. There is an aesthetic path taken up by Rancière and sundry others. There's Fred Jameson's path. This is my chance to outline Fred Jameson's, I think what I'd like to call it is his cognitive populism. That Jameson in particular, this is a conversation some of us were just having, would be held up as the taskmaster of critique over the last couple of generations, is really perverse, given how routinely Jameson has written in defense of ideology, reification, and the forms of lower cognition that Hegel called Vorstellungen, and that Fred, following Lévi-Strauss, usually just refers to as pensée sauvage. The most illuminating sentence I ever heard out of Jameson's mouth was his looking at a large seminar on allegory, holding the Fairy Queen open in his hand and saying, you know why this is important, right? And we all grabbed our pens. And he said, because if you want to fight it, you have to reify it. If you want to fight it, you have to reify it. So anyway, Fred Jameson does not serve as the paradigm of a critical literary intellectual, rarely practices critique in anything like the sense that Felsky means it. And you can grasp what is distinctive about the Jamesonian program if you think of it instead in terms of a certain cognitive populism. And then finally, there is a Marxist path, which I don't think, for all the writing on Marx, has been properly understood yet. So Marx, I would say, without further explanation, proposes what we might call a pragmatism in reverse. This will commit me to showing that the usual forms of left pragmatism, including standpoint theory, have got it exactly backwards. And I think a close reading of Marx can show this. And this pragmatism in reverse is what I would like to call uncritical theory. So that's the outline of the book. And you tell me what problems I have to solve.
Yeah. Could you just explain what you mean by cognitive populism?
Yeah, sure. So, so the figure that looms over that whole last section, where I mean to work my way through the many different proposals for getting past critique, the figure that looms over that is the figure of the unphilosophical many, the unphilosophical multitude, right? And the reason we never should have kidded ourselves about Spinoza being a left Enlightenment philosopher is his persistent demotion of the unphilosophical multitude, and his very plain recommendations in the Tractatus that there be state churches, right? That states retain state churches. It's not even an anti-clerical or anti-confessionalist argument to that extent, because almost nobody is capable of philosophy, right? So that a legislating and philosophically educated class will have to devise quasi-philosophical practices for the many. So that's once you see somebody who has been so embraced by emancipation-minded theorists making an argument like that, it raises the question of how anybody, especially people calling for a sequel to Critique, how they deal with the unphilosophical multitude. So the other point to keep in mind there is that this persists in Hegel, who is really Jameson's primary philosophical theoretical resource, more even than Marx has ever been. And it persists in Hegel in that what for Hegel is an inherited distinction between the way I think for a mostly kind of literary group the way we are, the way I like to think about it is as thought genres. So he's taking this over from Kant, but he has his own way of reworking it, where there is picture thought, there's Verstand, right, usually translated as understanding, which is the kind of classificatory and analytical thought of positivities that we normally associate with natural scientific method. And then there's Vernunft, and there's kind of speculative reason. And for Hegel too, they're in a plane hierarchy, right? That to work your way through Hegel's logic is to graduate out of Vorstellung into Verstand, and then, which, you know, presumably most grown-ups do anyway, but then to graduate out of Verstand into Vernunft, which you really need Hegel for. Jameson's major deviation from Hegel is to give priority to Vorstellung, to picture thought, or thinking through the concrete. If you know your Hegel, you know that's actually just giving priority to the aesthetic. So surprise, because Hegel thinks that art is thinking via the concrete. But that's, it's on those grounds too that Hegel subordinates art to both religion and philosophy. So it's Hegel, it's Jameson rather, who promotes to centrality the very cognitive functions that are in fact universally shared, and that the philosophers would call upon us to improve upon. All right, so cognitive populism. Yeah, please.
Can I ask about the place of hermeneutics in your genealogy?
Oh, I hadn't thought about it. Talk to me.
Well, I mean, I know.
So do you mean biblical hermeneutics, or do you want to talk God?
Schleiermacher,
Yeah.
etc. I mean, I know Rita Felsky has a strong attachment to hermeneutics.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a session which we were discussing reading methods. Her and I, Chris Newfield and Laura Bell put together at the MLA, and we were talking about reading methods. And, and she held on to hermeneutics.
She did. That's very interesting.
It's very important to her, and has been, she said, throughout her career, and all the different methods of reading. And it seems like German biblical hermeneutics would be something that...
Okay, so no, I can talk about that some. It's actually the course of reading I'm doing right now. It surprised me. It felt like the project looming into view when I realized that the primary resonance of the word critique in the 1840s for these left-wing philosophers wasn't content. I just assumed it was content. How could it not be content? Right? And it's not. The reason you know that it's not is that Bauer, who's the figure that I'm talking about, the Marxist first collaborator and his mentor, was a Protestant theologian. He taught in a Protestant theology faculty, and he was a Hegelian Protestant theologian, but in that context already wrote what he was calling critique, and it's very plain that he meant the historical critical method that had been kind of working across the 18th century in the German universities. So let me at least kind of make a pledge or explain the task that I've set myself. I'm very interested in how, that method is itself being adapted from early modern humanism, right? People know this. The intellectual historians are all over that, right? All you have to do is kind of close the loophole by which intellectuals humanists had previously agreed not to extend humanist reading methods to the sacred text. Right, Protestantism won't let them do that, right? Because the idea is in fact to have a humanism of the Bible, and that by establishing original and contextually bound meanings, you can get back to the pristine versions of the first Christianity, of an order of Christianity, which should then be the model for the church. So I'm interested in how an effort to ascertain the truth of Scripture within a historical context capsizes into a skepticism about Scripture, right? And where the promise, the promise to nail down meaning, this is a process we're familiar with, but I want to see how it overtakes the Germans. How the attempt to make meaning precise skids into a proliferation of meaning, which is how Bauer is eventually arguing, such that you're willing to get, or a sense of Scripture's unsolvable ambiguity such that you're actually willing to cede it as authority, right? So the reading techniques that they think are going to shore up a sola scriptura program end up destroying the Bible, at least for some set of intellectuals. And I want to know how that happens.
Sounds good.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Yes, this is slightly divergent, although I hope relevant. So in Anglophone conversation in the late 19th century, Matthew Arnold says, poetry will give us what religion no longer can. In the early 20th century, I.A. Richards runs the practical criticism experiments at Cambridge and shows that people can't read. It doesn't, I mean, this is a critique, I can't use that word. This is a problem that seems to be a problem of Felsky's rather than yours.
Yeah.
That is, it seems like Richards much more than anybody else. And the institutionalization of literary study to core is the villain.
Yeah, so that's hugely interesting, Jonathan. So I do think once, I mean, part of Marx's attack on critique, this is just walking up to what you said, but at an angle, it is even before the Communist Manifesto, it's what you might have expected from Marx. There is a class critique already there, right? He is interested in the authority that the radical philosophers seem to grant critical intellectuals. And eventually Bauer, it's the issue that they break over, Bauer having earlier said that critique's main enemy was the fusion of church and state, and the state churches more than anything as the vehicles for alienation. By the mid-1640s, this is happening very quickly, has decided that the real enemy of critique is die Masse, which doesn't quite mean the masses, but it's close. So the question in some ways becomes to whether or not the post-critical programs propose alternate adepts, right? And I do find that the aestheticizing programs, that would include Felsky's, but I think the problem is really marked in Rancière because of his overt egalitarianism, will not take the I.A. Richards problem at face value, which is to say that higher literacy is not widely distributed, that if we thought that was the way forward, we would have to organize for it. And we have a lot of evidence around that. Maybe it's pretty indifferent evidence. But I do think it's a huge problem for Felsky. I agree with you about that. Alex?
Yeah. So, can I be contrarian?
Yeah, please.
What would you say the proposition? There's never no critique.
Yeah. Sure.
And if
sure.
I mean, and really, let's take Marx. Okay.
Yeah.
I think in terms of historically speaking, what you're saying is correct. In terms of the German language and what is inherited, there's no doubt.
Yeah.
But if we're really going to kind of play a little game, if we're going to play language games, the critical faculty always involves a decision. There can never be a critical faculty in an abyssal way. So from that standpoint, although Marx is really attacking the bourgeois sort of practice of a certain kind of intellectual blah blah, right? That has no connection to reality. The one that refuses to come to a decision in that respect, it's unworldly, right? Is wrong, because of course it does. And he would, of course, agree that it does, because that's what he says. It's politically culpable in a certain direction, and against which he will propose another direction. His decisions will be of another kind. So, and this to me was always a great instructive principle in thinking about Thorne, of course, and his immanent critique, which is, of course, and also Freud, by the way, who Freud to me is actually essential here, but I don't want to go too far in this tangent. So the presumption that critique is something that must not be done because, et cetera, whether it's Felsky or any position. And in this respect, your reading of Marx, though, as I said, I don't want to be misunderstood, historically speaking, is correct. I think these positions need to be taken apart, at the at the feet before they even stand, because in effect what they're ignoring is that as they're doing their critique of critique, they're making a decision, which is with the job of critique. That is to say, to judge, because that's what it means, the Greek word, right? It means to discern and to judge. You cannot just simply discern. You can just say, this is here and that is there, in a kind of neutral way. You're always making a judgment. You're always creating values. You are always, of course, it's a political. So that's,
I don't disagree with it, and we can stick close to Marx's language, right? I didn't say enough about this just now. But if that teasing subtitle, right? It's a hugely polemical book, Marx's book, with a kind of belabored humor that no one has ever found funny. But Kritik der kritischen Kritik, the critique of critical critique, that is an interesting formulation, because it allows you a number of ways forward and may recommend all of them together. So one thing that I've been doing is tracking whether critique gets other adjectives, right? Because the problem is not critique, it's kritische Kritik, right? So are there versions of? I mean, you might say this is the pun opens up dialectical possibilities, but let's take them, seriously. Are there uncritical or non-critical versions of critique, and can things other than critique be critical? So that I've started tracking his references to the kritische Tat, kritische Tätigkeit, so the critical act, critical activity. So he does have that category. So that's hugely interesting. We know from that subtitle that he is still practicing critique in this book, and of course we know he's going to retain it as the title for his major project, which is still going to be the Critique of Political Economy, right? So figuring out what Marx would have us do other than critique has these other questions attached to it, right? So are there non-critical versions of critique? Can we practice something that isn't critique and still be critical? And then what does critique itself look like if he's doing a critique of political economy, even once you've kind of submitted critique to that much scrutiny?
Yeah, I would just simply add that it would be interesting for us to retain the phrase. The point is to change it as a phrase of critique, as a position of critique. Not just as some separate practice, separate, as if, or some magic. Or,
If we bring up the memory track. Don, please.
Yeah, very clarifying, and I like the decision that goes into the distinctions that constitute what I find really, to use your word, interesting about the talk. I'm fascinated by what enables you to move from one thesis to the next in the 10 theses. What is it that enables the shift, And why have you arrived in your 10th thesis at a figure that seems to be, in a certain sense, responsive to your redescription of the significance of Marxism? That you have to move beyond.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Ben. So there are two, I think, intersecting concerns there that I'm wrestling with both of them. I'm not an intellectual historian, but boy, am I feeling the pull of it right now, because there's some terrain here that you would think that that interval between Hegel and Marx would have been entirely picked over.
Your redescriptions, though, are decisive and enable you to, simply by redescribing, generate a kind of force of thought that it's endowed with the authority of the redescription, which you present as a judgment, and it's a decisive judgment in the strongest sense of criticism. So what I'm fascinated by is the means, the operator that enables you to shift from one position to the next, which is in effect going against the grain of established intellectual history, in order to produce by that alternative positioning a figure of thinking, namely yourself, that has altered the very grounds out of which critique can continue as a form of life that isn't always already somehow mystified.
I hope what you said is right. It's a description that matches my aspirations for the project. Reconstructing an intellectual history doesn't automatically give a position any authority. That's the problem that I'm wrestling with. And the specific version of that being that getting more precision over Marx's attack and critique and getting a better sense of what it means.
But every one of your statements is open.
Yeah.
I mean, but you state them with all of the authority of a Protestant theologian.
Yeah, in this one. I'm gonna grow the beard.
Very good.
Christian, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everybody.